For the UK in the 21st century topic, although there isn't a case study, we thought it would be useful to put together a few slides of some of the key themes in this particular module. The first one is about the physical geography of the UK. You can see from the relief map on the right that the mountainous areas in the UK are mainly towards the north and also towards the west of the UK, whereas it's much flatter and lower land towards the south and the east. Similarly, the rainfall is much higher in the areas that are mountainous. This is because we get relief rainfall. This is where the air full of moisture coming off the Atlantic Ocean, coming from the west, is forced to rise over the mountains, and therefore the air will cool and condense, and that's why it's much wetter in those mountain areas. You can see that as you start to move east, for example, the southeast, you can see is far drier with less than 600 millimetres of rain a year in comparison to over 3,000 in some of those mountain areas. The physical geography affects the human geography, and that can be seen in the population density patterns. The areas that are flat and lowland, for example in the southeast, are much more densely populated. So you can see London has more than 5,000 people per square kilometre. In contrast, the north of Scotland, where it's mountainous and therefore harder to build, less than 25 people per square kilometre. And this will then affect the land uses of those particular areas. So, for example, in mountain areas to the north and to the west, the land is too mountainous to really build on, so it tends to get used for things like sheep farming or maybe forestry. Whereas in the high density areas on the flatter land to the south and the east, we have large cities, we grow crops there, and so you can see the contrast. If you're asked about a physical geography issue in the UK, we'd recommend you talk about water stress in the south-east areas. This is caused by it being the area that receives the least rainfall, less than 600 millimetres a year, but then has the highest demand for water because it's where most people live and therefore they're using more water. The impacts of this are things like water sources like reservoirs and rivers. Their levels might go down because they're under stress. It might lead to shortages of water for arable farming, and so water then has to get pumped from rivers to then irrigate crops. And so the land can become very dry, and this might lead to dramatic responses from hosepipe bans to water being pumped from rivers to top up reservoirs, to us needing to build more reservoirs in these areas so we can store water, and so on. As your human geography issue, we recommend talking about housing shortages. This is caused by a steadily growing population and not enough new houses being built to meet the increasing population of the UK. The impacts of this are that house prices have gone up and up. The knock-on effect of this is that house prices are now unaffordable to a lot of people. It makes it very hard for a young person to be able to get on the housing ladder. And this leads to other problems, such as people having to live at home or rent much longer than they'd want to, or it could even lead to homelessness. The response is therefore to build more homes. You can see the fact there about Leicester. The question is then where to build them. Do you build them to the countryside on greenfield sites, or do you use brownfield sites where you knock down, for example, an old factory that might be derelict and you build some new apartments there? In Leicester, they've done a mixture of both. The old All Saints Brewery factory is an example of a brownfield site where they've knocked down a factory and built new apartments called the Woolcombe. On the topic of population change in the UK, we can see that in the 21st century we've seen a steady influx of migrants to the UK at around 450,000 per year as a net change in total. You can see that the top three countries are India, and again in Leicester 28% of our population is Indian ethnicity. Poland, again in Leicester since the year 2000 we've had 7,000 Polish migrants arrive, and Pakistan. This creates a diverse ethnicity in the UK. The demographic transition model is a population change model, and it shows how the population of a typical country changes over time, and also how that links to development. So at stage 1, a country might be really poor, and therefore there's high birth rate and there's a high death rate because people won't be living very long if they've not got access to healthcare, that kind of thing. As you move into stage 2, the birth rate's still high, but basic sanitation, basic hygiene like washing your hands after you go to the toilet, that kind of thing, starts to have a dramatic decrease on the death rate, and so the population goes up. As you move into stage 3, more advanced medical techniques continue to cause the death rate to decrease. At this stage now, the birth rate also starts to decrease. People might be wanting to work more, they haven't got as much time to be able to spend looking after their children, and they might have access to contraception, so they have more option to try and control the amount of children that they have. As you get to stage 4, we're now talking about an advanced country like the UK. The population is high but quite stable. In the UK we've got a slow but steady small increase in our population trend at the moment. But birth rate and death rate are both low. Again, in the UK the birth rate is now less than 2 children per household on average. This also links to population pyramids, which also is a type of graph that shows the number of people at a particular age making up your population. You can see the contrast there between an AC, the United Kingdom, and Zambia, which is an LIDC. So you can see the wide base for Zambia indicating a very high birth rate, and it rapidly narrows, which shows that not many people that are born are actually making it to old age. If you get asked about a population issue, talk about the UK's ageing population. This has been caused by increasing life expectancy due to advances in healthcare, as well as people generally trying to live healthier lives. Less people smoke now, people are more conscious about the need to exercise and eat a healthy, balanced diet. The impacts of this are both positive and negative. The positive is people are living longer, they get to spend more time with their children, maybe get to see and help look after their grandchildren. The negatives are that it increases the dependency ratio. This is the proportion of people under 16 or over 65 who depend on the working population, whose taxes are used to then look after these groups of people who aren't working. And so if the average elderly person is living to 80 as opposed to 70, that's 10 more years of funding that needs to be found, and that comes from the taxpayers. It also increases the pressure on our health services because elderly people are more likely to need to see the doctor. This issue has then led to some fairly dramatic responses. The retirement age is already having to increase. The amount of money spent on care for the elderly, building old people's homes, that kind of thing, has had to increase. Again, this puts a pressure on the taxpayer, and so taxes have to increase in order to pay for these things. You may be asked about the population change and diversity in a named UK place, in which case talk about Leicester. Now, although many of the Indian ethnic population moved to the UK before the 21st century, it's still continuing to have a dramatic effect on Leicester's culture, as you can see from the Golden Mile, the biggest Diwali celebrations outside India, the number of Indian restaurants. Since the year 2000, we can talk more about the influence of Eastern European migrants, such as 7,000 migrants arriving from Poland, and the fact that along places like Narborough Road, you can see an array of shops. Many of the signs on the shops are even in the Polish language. And so you can see that diversity reflected. There's, for example, a Polish church. There are many temples, for example, for Hindus that have come from India. On the topic of UK employment change, there are several changes that you could talk about. One would be a small increase in the percentage of women that are working. One reason for the change is that people are starting to have families at an older age than in the past, so they maybe start having children in their late 20s rather than their early 20s, and so women are working longer before doing that. Self-employment has increased in the 21st century. There was a crash in our economy at around 2008, and this meant that lots of people lost their jobs. And for many people that couldn't get another job, the solution was to set up their own business, become self-employed. As an overall trend, looking at the top right-hand graph, the number of tertiary jobs, that means jobs in services, is the area that has continued to increase. For example, mechanics, doctors, teachers, they are examples of service jobs. Whereas secondary jobs, for example in factories, have decreased. That's because we tend to outsource the manufacturing of stuff to countries like China, where we can get things made more cheaply. The quaternary sector is a relatively new sector, and this is the high-end technology sector. Because the UK has got very high-end universities, for example Oxford and Cambridge, they are developing new technologies. For example, the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. You may be asked about an economic hub and growth corridors. Economic hubs are areas where the economic growth, i.e. money and jobs growth, is strongest. Leicester is an example of an economic hub. To be an economic hub, you need the economy to be growing rapidly, and the evidence for this is that Leicester, although it's only got 400,000 people living there, more than 1 million people come to work in Leicester each day. To be an economic hub, you need a highly educated workforce. So Leicester's got the two universities, Leicester University, De Montfort University, as well as Loughborough University to the north. You need a diverse population to generate the range of ideas to come up with those jobs of the future. Again, Leicester has that. You need available housing for workers. There are lots of housing developments around Leicester, for example the All Saints Brewery apartments and all the new apartments being built along the River Soar. You want well-paid tertiary and quaternary jobs. Again, Leicester has that. There's many new businesses developing new technologies. For example, there's the Science Park, there's the Space Centre and offshoot jobs linked to those industries. You need modern transport infrastructure so that your workers can travel to work. Again, Leicester's got the M1 motorway passing through it, the main train line that goes all the way to London and up to Sheffield in the north, so it's easy for people to travel to Leicester. What tends to happen is along major transport links linking two economic hubs, you get what's called a growth corridor. So London is the biggest area for the UK's economy, and so along, for example, the M4 corridor, as it's called, from London to Bristol, many other industries have sprung up and new businesses alongside the M4 motorway, because that allows them easy transport access in and out of London. You might be asked about the topic of, is the UK losing its global significance in the 21st century? Now, on one hand, you could say that we used to have an empire that was the most dominant empire in the world, and now we don't. We used to be part of the European Union, but now we've, after Brexit, left that, and so you could argue we have less influence. But equally, you could say we still have a very strong political influence. We're still a respected country with a clear political voice. And that can be seen to our influence as part of global organisations such as the United Nations, through the charities that we support, such as the British Red Cross, which goes into conflict areas and areas of need around the world. The fact that we are one of the leading countries that make up NATO. Now, you'll have heard about NATO with the current Ukraine conflict. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, and UK was one of the leading countries pushing for countries to support the Ukraine by providing aid and weapons so that the Ukraine could defend itself against Russian aggression. A previous conflict where the UK had a significant influence was the Syria conflict from around 2011, where the UK's Air Force was used to take out chemical weapons manufacturing factories in Syria so as to try to end the horrific suffering of innocent people in Syria. You could also talk about the UK's media the music, TV and food as all being examples of the UK's global significance. Many of the most popular programmes in the world are in English, and so that has an influence on other countries that are getting to hear the English language spoken. In a typical James Bond film, they might see UK landmarks, they might see Buckingham Palace, and then that encourages tourism to the UK. And again, that influences and boosts the UK's economy. Products from the UK get then exported all over the world because they're popular, such as fish and chips or Scotch whisky, those kind of things. So finally then, that's a very quick overview of the topics. You'll need to revise them in more detail, but hopefully that's helpful as a start point.